In this lesson, we'll learn how to control the reflection and refraction of the mental ray architectural material. Okay, great. So in the last lesson, we had begun to explore this MIA material X, and we learned that both mental ray and this specific material are both designed to produce highly realistic results based on physical accuracy. So we looked at the diffuse attributes down here. Let's go ahead and expand the reflection rollout here and begin to look at this. I'm going to come up here and go ahead and render the current frame, just so we can take a look at exactly what the render looks like in its current state. And when that comes back to us, you'll see here that based on the reflection settings currently, got actually a fair amount of reflection showing up on our surface here, kind of making it look a little bit like plastic. So now, if we look over here, the first attribute you're going to see here is the color, and typically you're going to want to leave this set as white. Below that, you're going to see the reflectivity attribute. Now, right now, the default setting is 0.6, and you can see we've already got a pretty large amount of reflection on this. However, if we didn't want that amount of reflection, we wanted maybe less, we could always come in and reduce this. I'll go ahead and set it to something like 0 so we can re-render and take a look at what that looks like. Now when that comes back, what you're going to see here is for this material, it's been rendered with absolutely no reflections whatsoever. So there's no reflections at all present there, and it actually looks pretty similar to the Lambert 1 that we rendered in the previous lesson. Now I'm going to go ahead and set this back up to a value of 0.6 here, and let me just double check, make sure we do have one saved, and I do. So now let's talk a little bit about glossiness, because glossiness can be a little bit confusing. Now I want you to watch this little highlight that's right here on this sphere above. As I begin to reduce the amount of glossiness, you're going to see that that highlight first, it looks like it's growing, but the more I drag this, it's starting to blur out some. And if we kind of drag that close to all the way down, you're going to see it almost completely blurs out. Well, that's exactly what glossiness under reflection is controlling. It's controlling the blurriness of the reflections. And not just the highlights, that's all reflections here. So if we came in and set this to something like maybe a 0.2, nice round number, went ahead and rendered this out, make sure we just save this for comparison. We can always delete it later if we don't need it. What you're going to see here is that based on the original render, which was right over here, we had these very crisp reflections. A good example of that is this light source right here that's being reflected, this window that has 6 rectangular shapes. Well, if we come over here and look now, you can see that that has been blurred out significantly. Now, sort of a side effect of a lower glossiness setting is that you may start to see some of this noise or this pixel type effect around your reflections. And if this is the case, then you may need to come over here and begin to increase the glossy samples. Now, fair warning, you start to increase this and you will increase the render times. Right now we're sitting at about 19 seconds, but if I were to bump this up to, say, a value of 100, something like that, we'll go ahead and save for comparison and re-render this. What you'll notice when our result comes back, if we get in on this pretty tightly, you'll notice that these reflections have been smoothed out quite a bit here. So this was before and this is after. Now, important to keep in mind that we have bumped up the render time by a few seconds, but in this case, if we really needed those softer, blurrier reflections, then that's something we would have to do so we could get rid of this noise. All right, fantastic. Now, at this point, I'm going to go ahead and bump this back up to a glossiness. Actually, let's set the samples back to 8, reset that back to the defaults, and as well as pull the glossiness all the way up here. I'll go ahead and just re-render here so we can set up kind of the base render that we started with here. Now, what you need to know about reflections in terms of mental ray and specifically this MIA material X is that reflections are carrying the weight of really the reflections and the specular highlights here inside this material. Now, you may have noticed if you've used many of the Maya materials, maybe a blend or a Fong, there's not a specular color or a specularity related attribute here within the attribute editor for this MIA Material X. That's because specular is really a fake. If you think about it, everything in the real world is reflections. Even those specular highlights that you observe with your eye, that's really just a reflected light source. So reflectivity carries the entire weight of this with MIA Material X. Now, in this case, if maybe we wanted to just see the highlights, we didn't necessarily need the reflections, but we just wanted kind of the specular highlights. We could come over here and just check this highlights only box. Come in, save for comparison, and re-render. What that'll do is we'll completely remove all of the reflections except for the reflections that are perceived as a highlight. So you can see a few of them here, a couple of them down here, but for the most part, those reflections are gone. We are left with only the highlights here. So again, you can cut a few seconds off your render time by doing that if you need to, but that option is available for you. All right, fantastic. So this is the reflection attributes, and we're going to talk a little bit more about these here in just a moment, but let's come down here and talk about refraction for just a moment. So right now we're dealing with kind of this purple material, but let's say that we wanted to create something that looked kind of like glass for this, this housing here. Well, refraction is really important because this is where, that's where we can find this transparency attribute. So let's go ahead and change that. The first thing we need to do is change that from a value of 0, which is no transparency, completely opaque, to a value of 1. We want this to be completely transparent. And you can see up here in our thumbnail preview that, yes, indeed, we are now completely transparent. So if we were to come in and re-render this frame at this point, you'll notice in the rendered result, our material now looks completely transparent. We can see right through this. Now, this is something that's located under refraction because refraction is an important component to transparency. If you think about it, the way transparency works is light rays pass through a surface. Now, depending on what kind of surface those light rays are passing through, those light rays are bent and change direction a certain amount. That's where this index of refraction comes into play. So my default setting here is a 1.4, but if we were to set this to a value of 1, what that's going to tell Maya is that these light rays don't need to bend at all. They need to pass directly through and continue going the direction they struck the surface in. So if we were to come over, let's just save for comparison and re-render and see what that looks like. What you'll notice is while yes, we do get a transparent material here, our eye tells us that something's wrong here. Something just isn't quite right. Again, those light rays are passing completely through this surface and they're not bending at all. So our eye knows that there's something wrong here. Now, when it comes to what setting you need to put in here for the index of refraction, this all depends on what type of surface that you are applying this material to. If it's something like water, maybe, then that's going to have an index of refraction of about 1.3. In the case of glass, you're going to be looking at something approximately around 1.5. So if we were to go ahead and re-render this frame with an index of refraction set to 1.5, you'll see here that this is relatively close to our original result. A few of the highlights are changing places, a few of the reflections are changing places, but very, very similar. All right, great. Now, keep in mind that this is completely transparent, colorless glass at this point. It's picking up a little bit of color in reflections, but there's no color that's been assigned to this material, to the transparency in this material. Now we can change that with this color attribute right over here. Let's say we'll just click on this and maybe we want to apply this green color right here. We want it to kind of appear like a green glass. Well, let's go ahead and render that out and see what it does. We'll go ahead and render that frame again. And when that comes back to us, what we're going to see is, well, sort of a mixed result. We have sort of this mixture of purples and greens here, and it really does just kind of destroys the illusion that this is purple, or rather green glass. It doesn't really look like this at all. Well, if you remember in the last lesson, we set the default surface color here to this purple color. And this is where you would want to begin to utilize this weight attribute. If we wanted this to be green glass, we need to drop this weight all the way to 0 so that there's no influence of this purple color at all. You can see it obviously plays a pretty big role in what we're seeing in this render. So we'll save that for comparison with that weight set to 0, and we'll go ahead and re-render this frame. And when that comes back to us, you can see here, now we're talking. Now we got kind of this transparent green glass-like material instead of kind of that purplish green mess that we had before. All right, great. Now there's one other attribute here. It's called glossiness. Again, we have glossiness under reflection, and we have glossiness under refraction. So here under refraction, glossiness simply controls the blurriness or the sharpness of the transparency. Now I'm not going to get into rendering with this attribute. You can feel free to experiment with this. Now it does work exactly like the glossiness under reflection though. If we were to drag this down, you'll see that the glossy samples becomes available to us. So we do have samples that apply directly to the glossiness of the transparency as well. All right, great. Now, at this point, what I want to talk to you a little bit about as we begin to wrap this lesson up is this BRDF rollout right here. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to come over to my layer editor, and let me just hide this shader ball. And I'm going to show this Fresnel layer. Now, on this layer, I simply have kind of a flattened cube here. But let's say we want this to be a piece of glass. And we'll just actually right-click on this guy. And let's assign an existing material for this housing mat. So basically, we've assigned the exact same material to this. Now let's talk about how this reflection is going to work on this. So if we came over to the attribute editor and back over to our housing material, let's actually take our reflection and let's bump that up. Let's take that all the way to a 1. Now the angle at which we view an object often has an effect on how we perceive the actual reflection on that. So if we're looking at this directly straight on, then we're going to see very, very little reflection. Let me just render that out and show it to you. When that render comes back, what you'll see is we actually can't see really any reflection at all on this piece of glass, even though I just turned that reflection up to a 1.0. Now, this is a reflection that we're viewing directly on. Pretty much straight on. And as you can see down here in the BRDF rollout, we actually have control over 0-degree reflection and 90-degree reflection. So right now my 0-degree reflection is set at about a 0.2, which isn't very high. So that's why we're not seeing much reflection here. Now, at this point, if we were to come in and look at this a little bit more indirectly, maybe we render it out roughly right about there. We'll go ahead and render that frame. What you're going to see here is that we're now seeing more of that reflection as a result of this viewing angle. We're now looking at this more indirectly. So if we wanted to do something like chrome for this piece right here, then we probably don't want it to be green first. So let me come up over here and I'll just drag this all the way down and back up. That'll change that over to white. And if we scroll down here, let's set this 0-degree reflection to something like a 1. Now at this point, if we were to come in here and kind of orbit back around to where we're almost on top of this again, and we'll jump back to our render view and just save that, re-render this again. And when that comes back to us, you'll see here that we now have reflections that are showing up inside of our render. And again, it's because we changed this 0-degree reflection attribute right here. Now keep in mind that the environment that this is in is kind of a dark hallway, so there isn't a whole lot to reflect as far as above this information, but we are getting significantly more reflection on this surface because we changed this value. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about this use Fresnel reflection here. So Fresnel is based on real-world properties of most surfaces. So by enabling this, our reflections are going to fall off and behave more realistically than if we did not use this setting. So anytime you're trying to get very realistic renders and include reflections, I would almost always turn on your Fresnel reflection here. So if we go ahead and render out using this setting here, again, this is going to produce a much more realistic fall-off of reflection, depending on how directly or indirectly we are viewing the object that has this material applied to it. All right, fantastic. So there's a couple other things that you should know about when it comes to the MIA Material X, and those are really the presets that it has available to it here. So you can always come up here to this little presets button. And if you click on that, you can see here that there are a number of different presets that we can begin to apply. So if we wanted something maybe like I don't know, let's say maybe a satin metal, we could come in here and apply that. All of the changes get made to the material to produce this satin metal look. And if we jump back over here and render this out again, you'll see in the rendered result that the appearance of this geometry is now that it is kind of a satin metal type plate. So again, we're going to be utilizing this MIA Material X almost exclusively moving forward in this course. So again, it's a material that I highly recommend you familiarize yourself with because it's great for virtually any hard surface object that you're rendering here inside of Mental Ray. All right, with that said, let's go ahead and move on to our next lesson, and we'll learn about the importance of object scale when rendering.